The founding of Cambridge is one of those things that, a bit like you drop a pebble into a pond and the ripples spread out through the centuries. Why do they come to Cambridge? Well, you listen to different chronicles at the time, they will tell you different stories. Cambridge dates from Roman times. The first settlement that we're aware of is on Castle Hill. It's a Roman fort there, and probably the area around Chesterton is the earliest sort of inhabited area of Cambridge. Cambridge in those days wasn't known as Cambridge, it was known as Grantabridge, so named after the river, the Granta at that point. It doesn't really become known fully as Cambridge until about 15 or 1600. Cambridge is a small town, but of regional importance. It has the castle, which was built in 1068 on Castle Hill, where the sheriff is based. And we think by the beginning of the 13th century, there are probably around about 2,000 people who live in Cambridge in that triangle of streets there. The founding of Cambridge is one of those things that, a bit like you drop a pebble into a pond and the ripples spread out through the centuries. It's very contingent on all sorts of small coincidences, small things that happen. So there had been a university in Oxford from probably the late 11th century, and certainly by the mid 12th century, helped by Henry II banning English students from going to study in Paris. So they navigate themselves to Oxford. And Oxford is a thriving centre of study with possibly as many as 3,000 students by the beginning of the 13th century. But the beginning of the 13th century was a turbulent time because it was the reign of King John, and King John was in dispute with the church, in particular with the Pope. And in 1208, England is placed under an interdict by the Pope because he is in an argument with King John about who should be Archbishop of Canterbury. John wanted his man to be Archbishop. The monks at Canterbury Cathedral had elected their own man. The Pope steps in and appoints a man called Stephen Langton, who was a professor in Paris whom John didn't like. And so he refused to accept this. There's a long dispute. And in 1208, England is placed under an interdict, and all the bishops in England, bar one, leave. So the church is in somewhat chaos. And the townsmen in Oxford take advantage of this. So there is a fight that breaks out between a scholar in Oxford and one of the townspeople, and the townsperson is killed by an arrow. Whether it was an accident or whether it was deliberate, you listen to different chronicles at the time, they will tell you different stories. Perpetrator flees, and the townspeople in Oxford, the authorities, can't get hold of him. So what they do instead is get hold of his housemates, 2 or 3 of them, and they execute them. They're hanged outside the walls of Oxford in blatant breach of normal legal process, also in breach of the right of the clergy in the Middle Ages not to be tried in secular courts. They should only be tried in church courts. This is only about 30 or 40 years after Thomas Becket is murdered in Canterbury Cathedral. So the church and churchmen are naturally frightened of reprisals by the townspeople of Oxford. The scholars appeal to the king. The king says, I'm not going to do anything about it. And so they flee. They leave Oxford. They're frightened about what the townspeople in Oxford would do to them. There'd been tensions between the university and the town for some time. And they go to different places. So some go a little bit further up the Thames to Reading. Some apparently go to Maidstone. And some come to Cambridge. Why do they come to Cambridge? Well, that may well have been because of a man called John Grimm, who was a senior official in the university in Oxford at the beginning of the 13th century. East Anglia is one of the most populous parts of the kingdom at this time, so it's not necessarily surprising that a group of scholars come to East Anglia. The first college is set up in 1284, Peterhouse, which is my college. And interestingly, it's set up outside of the city bounds. So the city bounds at that point are at St Botolph's Church on Trumpington Street. St Botolph was the patron saint of travellers. In 1201 and 1207, charters which established its freedom of the town to govern itself away from the sheriff, essentially, so that the town could run its own affairs and not be interfered with by the sheriff, who's based in the castle up on Castle Hill. So the town just feels, well, it's gained its freedom to run its own affairs, and then suddenly these scholars arrive. And as I said earlier, there are probably around about 2,000 people in Cambridge at the time, and there were 3,000 scholars in Oxford. And even if a third of them came to Cambridge, that's adding 50% to the population. Probably fewer than that who arrived in Cambridge to start with, but you can imagine that that is a big change, which would have caused tensions in and of itself. But then you have the fact that the university is granted these privileges, which essentially removes it from the jurisdiction of the town. So the university gets to set the rents in the town from a charter of Henry III in the 1260s, and the university is exempt from any sort of criminal activity that the scholars might do. So there is a significant amount of tension between the town and the scholars, which leads periodically to riots, the most significant of which are one in 1327 and another in 1381, which is at the time of the Peasants' Revolt. You often find tensions bubbling over at times of national crisis. So in 1327 there is a deposition of King Edward II and the arrival of King Edward III, and in 1381 the Peasants' Revolt, the Great Rising of 1381, as historians tend to call it now, affected large parts of East Anglia, of Essex and Kent and London, of course, but also came here to Cambridge. And the townspeople, along with people from the rural villages, came in and basically took out their frustrations on the university and the colleges, and there was a great deal of violence and destruction. There is a fight and certain students are killed. Some of them then, the first group flee to Northampton for a while before they are essentially told to come back by Henry III. There is a series of trials afterwards. The students get fined and the townspeople get hanged. It's important to stress that, nowadays we tend to talk about Oxbridge and the two universities as equal with each other and, great rivals with each other. I think for much of the Middle Ages, Oxford would have very much looked down its nose towards Cambridge. Cambridge was, a much smaller regional university and had nothing like the prestige of the University of Oxford. Oxford is an international university. It attracts scholars from overseas. It's not at the same level of Paris, but other than Paris, it's the sort of second university north of the Alps and has a strong reputation. So Cambridge is very much the little brother and essentially attracts its students from East Anglia. Oxford has strong sort of royal patronage in its early history. There are two big leaps that essentially allow Cambridge University to catch up with Oxford. By the 16th century, they are essentially parallel by that point. The first of those comes in the late 14th century, which is the time of what's known as the Lollard heresy. John Wycliffe was a prominent theologian in Oxford, and he developed heretical ideas about the Eucharist, about having the Bible translated into English. And so Oxford, for a time, becomes a hotbed of heresy and therefore becomes suspect. And you start to see patronage, particularly royal patronage, shifting away from Oxford to Cambridge in the 15th century, because Cambridge is regarded as orthodox and safe. The founding of King's College, for instance, Queen's College, Christ's and St John's, all founded by royal patrons in the 15th and early 16th century, really allows Cambridge to start to catch up with Oxford. It succeeds in catching up and in some ways sort of overtaking Oxford during the crisis of Henry VIII and his break with Rome. When he wants to divorce Catherine of Aragon, he asks the universities of Oxford and Cambridge to make a judgment on whether his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was valid or not. The scholars at Oxford say that it was valid, which wasn't what Henry wanted to hear, and the scholars in Cambridge say that it wasn't valid, which is what Henry wanted to hear. And so you find that Henry then starts to patronise Cambridge, most notably, of course, in the founding of Trinity College in 1547. So that allows Cambridge and Oxford to end up in parity, basically, by the end of the Middle Ages. But before that, there was Oxford, I think, probably wouldn't have recognised a rivalry with Cambridge, though perhaps Cambridge did with Oxford the other way around.